So, as you can tell from the title, and probably already knew because you joined in, today I would like to talk about multi-drug resistance in bacteria. And let's start with a brief introduction into the history of antibiotics. So, the history of medicine is largely a history of infectious diseases that have plagued humanity ever since we started living in society. And we're talking diseases like tuberculosis, all kinds of diarrheas, pneumonias, cholera, the plague, syphilis, the list goes on. And all of these are caused by bacteria. And we know that now, but for the majority of human history, we did not know this. And people had all kinds of ideas what might be causing this bad air or miasma or the wrath of God. And I don't know if any of you ever got sick and tried to pray it away, but it's not very effective. However, in the late 19th century, with the advances in science and in the scientific method, people started formulating what's called the germ theory of disease. And this was pioneered by people like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. And basically, what they realized that these infectious diseases are not, in fact, caused by God sending us bad air to punish us for our sins, but instead by small organisms that are invisible to the naked eye, but still can grow inside us and be transmitted to other people, infecting them. At this point, I think it's good to make a very important point that bacteria are not the same thing as viruses. Bacteria are small single-cellular organisms which can grow on their own, as opposed to viruses, which are not alive in the real sense of the word. They're basically organic DNA or RNA containing crystals. And antibiotics only work on bacteria, they do not work on viruses. And so after we realized that we are actually in a race with bacteria and other microorganisms, together with the development of industry and chemical industry and science in general, in the early 20th century, we started developing the first antibiotics. And I'll give you a couple examples. So in 1907, the antibiotic salvarsan was developed, which was an arsenic-containing compound, which is very difficult to handle. And arsenic is toxic to most forms of life. So while it could kill the syphilis, you also run a chance that it was going to kill the patient. So it was definitely not an ideal solution. In 1928, we have this famous eureka moment when penicillin was discovered by Alexander Fleming, who mythically or reportedly came into his lab and found mold growing in his petri dish, killing some of the bacteria in its vicinity. However, penicillin was also not easy to make for more than a decade and was not mass produced until the Second World War. And in 1932, came to the development of Prontosil, which was a product of the growing dye industry, in which a lot of new chemicals were being screened whether they could possibly be active against bacteria. And this was the first antibiotic in a sulfonamide class, which is a class that still exists today. And I think, especially in this day and age, we tend to take antibiotics for granted. But back in the early 20th century, this was truly a revolution in medicine, because all these diseases that I mentioned at the beginning, for the first time in history, could be reliably treated and even cured. And especially, I would like to then bring two examples again. First was the Spanish flu, which is a virus disease. However, it is now widely accepted that the majority of deaths between 1918 and 1919 were actually due to secondary bacterial infections and not the virus itself. However, since this was before antibiotics became discovered and mass-produced and used, there was not really much you could do. And then in the Second World War, when penicillin became mass-produced as part of the war effort, especially in the US, this allowed a lot of the soldiers who became injured to actually survive and come home, while otherwise they would probably die of infection, sepsis, and other complication related to all these horrible injuries that we're sustaining. And antibiotics, as I said, they're almost a miracle drug, and they're a very, very precious resource. However, we have not been treating them this way. And already Fleming in 1945, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, warned about the emergence of resistance. And actually, resistance to penicillin was already shown before penicillin even became used widely in medicine. And therefore, the development of resistance cannot be avoided. It's something that happens, and we have to try to manage this. We can try to work with it and against it, but we cannot avoid it. So why does resistance develop? And there are 6 main factors or drivers for antibiotic resistance, which you can see on the screen, and I will take you through them. So the first and foremost is that resistance is a natural evolutionary process. First off, resistance is a property of this bacterium that is encoded in its DNA. And these resistance genes, many of them have already existed in the environment before we even started using antibiotics. Because if you imagine, if you are a bacterium that produces an antibiotic to kill your neighbors, you have to be able to be resistant to your own antibiotic. Or if you're a bacterium that lives in the neighborhood of the penicillin mold, maybe you will be able to survive if you have developed a resistance. And this is called the environmental resistome, and it's actually a very large source of many resistance genes that we have to deal with. Second, if you put bacteria under selective pressure, they will adapt. Bacteria are quite an amazing group of organisms because they're very small, they divide really fast, and they mutate really fast. Therefore, they are capable of adapting really, really well to any adverse conditions. And third, what leads to dissemination of this resistance and also then creating multiple resistances in a single bacterial strain or species is what's called horizontal gene transfer. And what this means is that you do not only transmit these resistance genes vertically from you to your offspring, but you can also transmit these genes to your neighbors or to even other species. And there are 3 ways this can be done. First can be by exchange of plasmids, which are small circular pieces of DNA that bacteria can share, and these often carry the resistance genes. Second can be via phages. So phages are like viruses, except for bacteria, and they can carry pieces of DNA and genes from one bacterium to another. And third, it's called transformation, which is picking up DNA from the environment, which is actually quite rare in nature. There's not many bacteria that are very good at this. And even if you want to do this in the lab, you have to do a lot of stuff to the bacteria to make them pick up any DNA. However, there are certain species, such as Actinobacter, who are extremely good at this. And this is actually the first on the list of WHO's critically important pathogens. So this first driver is actually the most fundamental, and that's just nature, which we cannot really avoid. However, there are 5 more factors on this chart that have everything to do with humans and with us as a society. So the second driver is extreme selective pressure in hospitals. So if you take a lot of people who are, of course, very sick, that's why they need to be in the hospital, and you put them all in one building, and you give them a lot of antibiotics, and no matter how much you try, the building can never be 100% clean. This creates a perfect breeding ground for adaptation, for exchange, and the creation of many new strains that can be resistant to many different antibiotics. And this is also the part of the problem where people are dying, because if you are in intensive care and you are on a ventilator and you acquire antibiotic resistance pneumonia, it will be very, very difficult for you to get better and to survive. A third and related is the incorrect use of antibiotics in the community. So that means outside of the hospitals. And that is partially due to people coming to the doctor with a cold and wanting antibiotics, whether it's a rhinovirus or a real bacterium. Also, general unnecessary overprescription, people not taking the full course of antibiotics. So if you have antibiotics for 10 days and after 5 days you feel better and you stop taking them, that doesn't mean that all the bacteria have actually been killed. And the ones that survive are much more likely to have survived because they have become resistant or are on the road to becoming resistant. And also, in many places in the world, antibiotics are widely available without prescription, and people take them for anything and everything, which, of course, is very, very bad news. The fourth driver is the use of antibiotics in agriculture. And this is not only for veterinary treatment, if you have your food animals being sick, but also for prophylaxis, so they grow faster and so you improve yields. And it's actually quite shocking that 73% of antimicrobial drugs, which includes mostly antibiotics, is used in food production. So basically, we have literally been throwing our miracle drugs to the swine. And food-producing animals are already huge reservoirs of pathogens, and there have been many instances of pathogens jumping species from farm animals to humans. One of those cases we are very possibly living in right now. And if we add antibiotics to the mix, we can create much more serious pathogens that, if they then jump, this will become a much more serious problem. And resistance is also becoming an issue in veterinary medicine, where you do have antibiotic resistant bacteria. And if this was not enough, if you then use the manure as fertilizer, you can then take residual antibiotics or resistant bacteria and put them on the fields and put them in the same environment as the soil bacteria. And soil is one of the richest bacterial environments on the planet, where again, you create a really nice environment for bacteria to try out resisting your antibiotics. And if they find this out, then exchange this information. Fifth factor is the waste. And mostly I'm talking about wastewater. And it's actually more than 80% of all wastewater is released into the environment untreated, which is quite a shocking number. And this includes wastewater from hospitals, from pharmacological production, untreated sewage, especially from urban environments. And this not only can disseminate these resistant bacteria, but actually a lot of antibiotics make it through the human body unmetabolized. So you take them in, some of them kill the bacteria, but most of them actually go right through your route, right into the sewage. And if you do not treat this, then you are putting much more antibiotics back into the environment or into the environment. And actually, urban wastewater treatment plants are one of the biggest hotspots for the development and dissemination of resistance. And finally, there is the drop in the discovery of new antibiotics. So after the Second World War, when everybody realized how amazing antibiotics are, we had this huge spike in discovery, and we had every year new antibiotics, new different classes. It was called the golden age of antibiotic discovery. However, after this has ended, we have entered what's called the discovery void from 1987, since when we have not had any truly new antibiotics being discovered. Which means that in this race that we're running with bacteria, because we are trying to get away from them and we're trying to invent antibiotics, and they are trying to find ways to survive these antibiotics. And we stopped running. In 1987, we stopped running, but bacteria have not, and they're catching up with us. Of course, these 6 drivers vary depending on which country you're in, which part of the world you're in, but they all contribute to this big mix of factors that lead to resistance and multi-drug resistance. So with all this being said, we are facing a real threat of returning to the pre-antibiotic era, as in the era in which a mean bacterial infection could kill you. So where are we now then? In short, we are in very, very deep trouble. And antibiotic resistance is present everywhere. in all parts of the world, in low aquatic environments, in populations, there are certain infections in which more than 50% of the strain are resistant to the first line and even second line antibiotics. And this is a result of around 8 years of antibiotic use, overuse, and misuse. And to put some number on it, according to the WHO, this leads to 700,000 deaths a year from drug-resistant microbes. And this includes 230,000 from multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And in the worst case scenario, if no action is taken, this is projected to be 10 million a year by the year 2050. And this is of a concern to many international organizations of WHO, the ECDC, so the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, and even the World Bank, which says drug-resistant infections are a threat to our economic future. And the World Bank is not usually the institution that concerns itself with natural science. So we are moving full circle into the pre-antibiotic era. To make this a bit more, to visualize this a bit better, if you have caught bacterial pneumonia in the 19th century, there was probably not much that could be done to help you. And there was a very good chance that you were going to die. In the 1960s, in the golden era of antibiotics, you would have gone to the doctor, gotten the newest, shiniest miracle drug, and you would most likely be fine. Today, that's still mostly the case. However, some of these people will actually be infected by a resistant organism, and they will need to go to the hospital and need to go to the ICU and receive second, third line antibiotics, which of course are much harsher and have much more side effects. And the chances are not as good as they were a couple decades ago. And if we do nothing, it's very possible that in a couple decades, even those antibiotics that still work will not work anymore. So if you will get this pneumonia from a resistant bacterium, the situation might be the same as in the 19th century. And it will be the same. Unless we do something, it will be. And the WHO is trying to create all these lists. So it creates a list of priority pathogens, which specifies them depending on how dangerous they are, how widespread they are, and also the list of critically important antimicrobials. So not all antibiotics should be used as first line. Maybe some of them need to be saved for those cases when people actually have a resistant infection. And this full circle is really starting to happen with tuberculosis, because tuberculosis used to be a really horrible disease and a huge killer. It used to be called consumption because basically you would slowly waste away and die. And the best things we could do for a lot of people was to send them somewhere into the hills and mountains with some fresh air and puncture their lungs if things got a bit too bad. But then when we could give them antibiotics, this became much better and you could actually treat and manage tuberculosis. But now, with the spread of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and extensive drug-resistant tuberculosis, this is starting to become a huge problem. But of course, this is a problem mostly in the low and middle income countries. So for a lot of the people, this is quite removed. So, and the last part is that I have already told you, and that is we have not really had any new antibiotic classes since 1987. The WHO lists two examples of new antibiotics, but they're either combination of existing antibiotic or they are the first time a certain class is being used, but in fact, this was already discovered in the 1950s. So the discovery void keeps going. And so we urgently need new antibiotics, because no matter how well we treat our waste, how well we ration our antibiotics, how carefully we take all 10 days of our antibiotic course, if we stop using them to feed our cows, we still need new antibiotics because the bacteria keep running and they're catching up. So why are we not getting these new antibiotics then? If we need them and if we know that we need them, Why are we not getting them? And here I would like to quote a report from the Interagency Coordination Group of Antimicrobial Resistance that was sent to the Secretary General of the UN, which says there is a lack of scientific innovation resulting in part from market failure with too few new antimicrobials, vaccines, diagnostic tools, and alternatives to antimicrobials for use in humans, animals, and plants in the research and development pipeline. And why is this? Why are they talking about market failure? Well, the drug development is done mostly by for-profit pharmaceutical industry. And this is quite interesting because this is the part of healthcare which is concerned with development, production, and distribution of medicine. And this is a huge industry. Its net worth surpassed $1 trillion in 2014, and it's growing very nicely. And this includes companies like Pfizer, Roche, Novartis, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, and the list goes on. And this industry is also growing in China, of course. So it's a huge booming industry. However, these companies are profit-oriented, and that means their first priority will always be the bottom line. And we're dealing with issues of long-term planning in an industry that's driven by short-term profits, because drug development is a very long and costly process, and it can take somewhere between 10 to 20 years, and it has multiple steps. So you start with your lead compound, which you think, okay, this might kill this bacterium or this cancer cell. Okay, that's really good. But there's many things you have to check between this and the first patient taking the drug. You have to check, okay, does it kill bacteria, but does it maybe also kill my patient? What are the side effects? How do I get it into the patient? How do I make this on a large scale? And once you have figured these questions out, then you have to do clinical trials, which are usually 3 phases. And you start with a couple tens of patients, a couple hundred patients, to a couple thousands patients, so 5,000, 6,000 is quite a normal number for the last phase of the trials, which are necessary for regulatory approval. And then you have to still produce, distribute, and market these drugs. And the marketing is especially a big factor in the US pharma industry, which is where most of the pharma industry is actually located. And during this process of 10 to 20 years, you not only have to pay for all the drugs that make it, but also for all the drugs that have failed. And this can be 80% of the drugs will never make it to the market. So therefore, you have to think, okay, not all drugs are equally profitable. What would be the best thing for me to invest into? And I'll tell you 2 extreme examples. On one side, with antibiotics, which are not actually a very good business model at all, because they will be taken episodically for a couple of weeks, for a couple of months, if it's tuberculosis, once or a couple times in your life, mostly by people in low and middle income countries. So you cannot really sell it for much profit. And no matter what you do, in a couple of years, the resistance will develop. So your drugs will become much less useful and eventually possibly even useless. So not very good for business. On the other extreme of the spectrum, we have the 5th generation drug for an age-related disease, such as high blood pressure or diabetes. This you can sell to people for years to decades, to aging populations in rich countries, where you can sell them for huge profits, especially in the US. So if you are facing this prospect of 10 to 20 years of expensive development, it's quite clear which of these 2 extremes you're going to lean towards. And as a result, large pharma companies have actually left the field of antibiotic R&D. And this is a huge problem because we have the small and medium-sized companies trying a little bit to do something with this, but it's not really working. So I think it's quite clear that the profit-oriented pharma industry will not solve this problem. They don't seem to have any incentive, and they have not developed anything new for decades. So the question is, what would be a better way to do this? Would there be a better system to develop drugs, antibiotic or otherwise? And there are many people who have many ideas, and I'm actually quite curious if anybody has any other ideas. Please tell us in the discussion. This is just one. And I believe what we need to do, we need to remove profit from the equation. Because I think most people would agree that healthcare is not a commodity to be sold, but instead a right. If you are sick, you have a right to be helped so that you feel better. So why would we put one of the huge parts of healthcare into the hands of a profit-oriented industry? So what I would suggest or propose is using academic research when collectively owned and planned production. Let's break this down. So if we want to produce something, we need three factors. We need the labor, we need the resources, and we need the capital. So when it comes to labor or personnel, people are there. The academic system produces more people with master's degrees and with PhDs than the academic system can absorb. And these people often have to leave academia if they want to or not. And many of us do not want to sell our souls to a huge pharma company to develop a 5th-generation drug against diabetes. Also, you have the people who already exist in the pharma industry, both in R&D and also in the production. So the labor is there. The second factor is the resources. And this would require a massive scale up of academic research capacities because what we have now would not be enough. And a collectivization of the existing capacities in the pharma industry, both R&D and production. And the third factor is capital. And again, if we already manage to collectivize the pharma industry, their huge profits can provide a nice chunk of capital to start this. And of course, we should anyway be redistributing our existing resources in a way that we allocate a larger percentage of the GDP to research and education. Of course, the question is, how do we make this happen? How do you persuade people this is a good idea? How do you collectivize a huge company like Pfizer? In this pandemic that we're living through right now, there has been some nationalization, collectivization of hospitals in Europe, but this is a completely different scale and a completely different system. So the details here, we still need to work out. To finish, I would like to leave you with one last quote from the Interagency Coordination Group of Antimicrobial Resistance from last year. And it goes, "There is no time to wait. Unless the world acts urgently, antimicrobial resistance will have a disastrous impact within a generation." Thank you.